All right, so a quick agenda. How many of you guys are familiar with SSH, Secure Shell? Okay, so I'll get to go through the first part quickly. Maybe we'll save some time there. But some key things that I want to go over. Of course, it's a cryptographic protocol. It's used for remote login, administration, file transfers, things of that sort. It's open source and commercial. SSH Communications, our innovation officer actually is the original inventor of the protocol. And of course, it started off as open source and decided that we needed to make a commercial version to support industries and larger industries and things of that sort. It's a client-server application, as many of you know, widely used on Linux, Mac, Windows, mainframes. This is how important is Secure Shell in organizations? So we actually had a Forrester research done, and 82% of organizations said that they use Secure Shell within their organization. I personally think that's probably a little low number. I'm pretty sure there's even more than that. They also said that 68% consider it Secure Shell important to their organization. Again, I anticipate that's a little low because I think that there's critical data being transferred on almost any large organization, but that's the data that they came across. So what are the popular uses of Secure Shell? Again, most of you guys are aware of Secure Shell, so I'll go through this very quickly. Again, the research that was done, administration was one of the big reasons that people use Secure Shell and enterprises and organizations use Secure Shell. Certainly can be done for for different reasons, whether it's machine to machine. Sorry, I skipped. I actually realized I skipped, but sorry, data transfer is the first one that I should have been discussing. So machine to machine communications, whether that's interactive and non-interactive, data being transferred, whether for secure file transfer or processing and things of that sort. Access control, administering machines, data center management, another key point to allow people to have access to those machines. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that can also be a risk. It's a great tool to be able to allow people to do the administration using a secure method, so the passwords and things of that sort, and the data and the commands that are being used aren't sent over the wire, unencrypted. Third one, we'll talk about it briefly, but in some sense you can use it as a VPN-like tool. It's not a typical VPN as most people would know as a VPN, but our SSH does support, Secure Shell supports tunneling. And I'll bring up a little later why that's important, because there is some security risks around tunneling and allowing people getting access within an organization using tunneling or remote tunnels and things of that sort. Again, basics around the authentication of SSH. So one of the key points of SSH is that authentication piece. First, in the first part of the connection, that authentication, the client has to verify that the server is who it says it is, so that it prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. And to do that, in most cases, it's a key pair, essentially, or a certificate that's used. There's probably some other methods, but that's probably 99% of what I've seen in organizations. Second piece is user authentication. As all of you know, it could be a password, it can be a public key or user key, it can be RSA token, things of that sort. So there's a wide variety. And that wide variety also can lead to possible attack vectors if you open those systems up to be able to be accessed through very different ways of authentication. So here's an audience question, kind of already asked. How many of you know what Secure Shell is used within your organization? Okay, pretty good amount of people. How many of you personally use Secure Shell? Either interactively or have an application that you own that you know that there's data being transferred or things of that sort. Okay, again, quite a few people. And then, of course, the third question is always a doozy. How many of you know what your Secure Shell policies are for setup, configuration, and the administration of those connections that go into the Secure Shell? Does anybody? So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. That's actually segues very well into the next part, secure shell risks. So again, we talk about encryption, and some people think, and some companies think, we have encryption, so therefore we're secure. But that encryption, SSH, that secure shell, is providing you access. And so just because you're secure does not mean that, or everything, your data is encrypted does not mean that you're secure. It actually can be, in the case of, the first one there, the data in transit encryption, it protects your sensitive data. That's the good. But you're blind also to what data is being transferred. So how many of you know what data is being transferred over your, let's say, SFTP connections? It's very difficult to do because it's encrypted. It's like Leo was mentioning about the trunk that wasn't able to be opened. So the next thing is remote access to systems. Of course, the administration piece of that provides them access so they can pull additional authentications if they have the privileges to do so. They can pull data off of those systems very easily once they've gotten into those systems. So the authentication piece and the administration piece is the good, but there's the other side of it. You have to consider that if that authorization is used, you have to make sure that you know who actually has that access and can get into those systems. Otherwise, it could become an attack point, either from a malicious insider or someone that gets in and starts gathering data on the systems and propagating, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Command execution, kind of the same as administration, except for it's a one-time command that gets executed. Most people don't actually restrict the commands that are being used. So command execution is kind of the same thing. It's in a way, I mean, you can do various different things. Usually it's a bit more locked down than giving full access to execute any command within the system. Tunneling, that's why I mentioned the VPN. So tunneling is interesting because it allows for you to secure maybe a legacy legacy tool or something of that sort over a secure channel. We actually do that with TN3270 connections for our connections to our mainframes. So things like that, but it also can allow someone to bypass a corporate firewall. In most cases, corporations will allow SSH outside of their network, either or by port or not actually have their firewalls looking for SSH as a potential outbound connection. So I get to set up a system in my home, a server, SSH server in my home, create what's called a remote tunnel out to my system, allowing me, when I leave the premises, I then have continuous access inside of someone's network. It can go the other way. Let's say you block video game playing within your corporation. You could set up a tunnel and tunnel that data outside, and you could have someone sitting on your corporate computer playing a video game. So we talked a little bit, or I should mention, so this is actually one example of a real bank in Europe where we did a scan of their system. This is one connection into a machine as one particular user. This is just at one level. So how many servers can connect to this one single server as this one user? And that's just looking from the first level. So the other thing that we try to do whenever we're speaking with our customers is get them to think about where those hops can happen. So I forget who it was, but they mentioned that you could potentially jump from one server and then into another server like that. So if we start to go to 2 levels, this is what we saw. And I don't know if this is a privileged user or not, but essentially, once you start looking at where that transit of trust is on even just a second level, it increases the number of connections that can happen. So one person gets access to one machine as that user, they could propagate out to the other machines in any way. Even if you block certain ones, they could continuously hop to different machines in order to finally get into that one machine that they're looking to get to. Another audience question. Does your company monitor SSH usage? I kind of asked it already, but it's kind of difficult because it's not just whether you can monitor the data, but you might have a Jumphost, for instance. So we actually had Forrester research that said 44% of organizations using SSH are actually monitoring the SSH usage. That's a bit scary that there's over half of the companies that were interviewed are not doing any SSH monitoring in their organization. Does your company have the ability to report on SSH keys and authorizations? Does anybody? So there are some companies out there, certainly, but 34% of organizations in this research found that, or were indicated that they had the ability to generate reports on who had access to what. So again, we go back to that transitive trust mapping. If you can't build a report, you still have that risk. That risk is in place of all of those, one machine getting breached, and then all of the connections, all the other servers that are able to gain, that the person would be able to gain access to could also be breached potentially as well. So again, I mentioned Jumphost a little bit. This is a pretty popular way of monitoring SSH usage, and the reason that it's done is to be able to prevent systems or users from getting access, especially to production machines, and without what they're doing being monitored. You could look at log files, but if they're a root user, they can go in and modify log files, as many of you probably would know, and things of that sort. There is a way around Jumphost as well. Unless you have firewalls or something in place blocking that access, you can simply create a new SSH key, or if you have the ability to create a login, a password on the system or additional login, you can bypass the Jumphost. I've worked with companies that have this in place, and that's part of the reason that they've come to us and said, we need to know what our keys are, what our authorizations are within SSH, and do this kind of scan of their systems and things of that sort. Again, kind of on the Jumphost side, we found from IDC Research that 20% of identities are centralized and managed, and that leaves 80%. So you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. Most of the 80% are going to be machine-to-machine authorizations. So your application talking to another application. But again, if that node is breached, then that is a potential attack point for someone, either a malicious insider that may have access to all these machines and can jump to other machines to gather more data, to get more authorizations, to gain access to more machines and things of that sort. Current state analysis. So this is a bit more of what we've seen in some of the research. So some of the things that we've seen is that most enterprises don't know who has access to Secure Shell. In many cases, there's Secure Shell access and owned by an application owner, but the application owner doesn't actually even know what their keys are used for. I heard today from a company that they as part of their cleaning up of their keys and trying to get their SSH keys in order, they removed a key that wasn't supposed to be removed because the application owner wasn't aware. That mistake cost that company $14 million. Other thing, how many authorized users are out there? And this goes for not just keys, but also password authentication, any user's authentication, especially on Linux and Unix machines, where you don't have a centralized directory in a lot of cases. There are centralized directories used on Unix and Linux, but in some cases you don't have that. In a lot of organizations you don't have that. So you don't have that full knowledge of that, of what authorized users are gaining access. What versions are active of SSH? So number of vulnerabilities have come out in the last year. So not specifically necessarily to SSH, but you've probably heard of some of the SSL bugs and things of that sort. So knowing which versions are there and whether they're potentially compromisable versions is very important, and a lot of organizations don't have that data that we've seen. Kind of which keys have the greatest risk. In most cases, the PCI environments for some of the banks in New York that we've worked with and things of that sort, and where they'll actually fail an audit. So one of the things that's in most of the compliance, and compliance is kind of the last item on the list of things to go over, and hopefully have some time to go over that. But is separation of duties. What we've seen is a lot of companies will think that they have something very clean and simple like this. But what happens in some of the companies that we've seen is that you do a build out, and the developers need access to put their application out there or to modify an application. It's still not in production, let's say. That server gets moved to production. A lot of times companies aren't cleaning out those existing logins or those authorizations, the keys or anything like that that give those developers access. Another organization had a situation where they had a developer accidentally putting developer data into a production environment. Again, millions of dollars worth of loss in that situation. Again, current state analysis, some of these things you guys may have already heard of. The mask is actually advanced persistent threat, as you've heard some of the other speakers talk about. One of the things that it targeted was SSH keys, gathering SSH keys, being able to trying to figure out what servers it could be able to access with those keys. Of course, it had other things, and that was active for 7 years. And how many people have rotated their SSH keys? Yep. So again, I don't know how many people are actually using SSH keys, but in a lot of cases, those keys could have been compromised for this particular attack without the company even knowing. So it's very important to have that mapping, have that ability to see what keys are out there, and therefore being able to rotate those keys and clean those keys out just like you would your password. Okay. So I'll go through these quickly because I want to get to the compliance piece. But Focator is another Trojan that was capable of stealing SSH credentials. Again, being aware of what versions you have out there, making sure that it's not at risk of being compromised in some of these Trojans or other applications that are being released. Edward Snowden is another example. They've not announced all the details of the attack vector that was used, but they have mentioned that he was able to fabricate digital keys. And it's possible if he was able to do that, he could have used SSH potentially. I'm not saying he did because I have no proof that he did, but he could have used SSH as an attack vector because if he could generate digital keys, whether it's certificates or public user keys, certainly would be an ability for him to be able to get into some of the systems that he did. Insider threat example, HostGator, employee gained access. Again, there wasn't good controls over what he had access to. He was able to gain access to 2,700 servers and still had access after they let him go. Some of the things we have uncovered, 90% of the time SSH credentials used to authenticate are not properly managed. It's kind of mentioning the same thing, but one of the interesting things that we found is, on average, one unknown root key for every 10 servers. Again, it's on average. So what I mean by that is they've identified that there's a public key, an authorized key out on a production server, and they don't know where the private key is. So they don't know who has the private key to access that system, and they don't know where that key is sitting. 90% of keys are inactive or redundant. So if someone leaves the company, you don't remove the keys for that user, things like that. Frequent access in production environment with unknown keys. So they don't have scans that tell their keys or their authorizations. Okay, so SSH challenges, human error is one of them. And the adding and the removing of keys can be complex, so that management, that process around that policy, as I mentioned in the beginning, is very important to make sure that your keys don't get out of source. And monitoring and controlling activities of users. Of course, what we talked about, monitoring the data that they're transferring is a bit difficult. There are some methods of doing that. Essentially, a friendly man-in-the-middle attack, as we call it. There are some methods of getting that data and then passing it off to something like a DLP to see if that they're transferring any data that maybe they shouldn't. But monitoring and controlling the activities of these users is a big challenge for corporations. And I'm not going through the whole list on just these top three. So, maintaining SSH configurations across the organization. Some organizations have a rule that they don't allow root login. You have to log into a system, and then you have to switch your user over into root if you need to do an administrative task. SSH is one of those tools that will allow you to log in as root if you have that capability, if that capability is set up in your configuration. So having a standard configuration and a policy around that configuration is very important as well. Compliance. I know I'm running short on time, so I'll go quick. I'm sure everyone here has at least heard of one of these. PCI DSS, HIPAA, ISO 27002, NIST, Corbett, SSA, MAS, or Basel. All of these guidelines essentially are that. They're just guidelines. They don't call out SSH specifically. They say, well, I'll move on. So continuous monitoring, lifecycle authorization, access controls, and configuration controls. So, oops, sorry. Like I mentioned, they're not going to tell you, you need to do this with your SSH. They're going to tell you the requirement, develop and maintain secure system application. That's pretty vague. They get down into a little bit more detail, but it's up to the organization, it's up to the security folks to realize that SSH is a part of this. It's allowing authentication into systems, is allowing authorization to data that's potentially could be breached or should be secured, and it's up to you guys to actually identify that and secure that in the way that is right for your organization. I'm probably out of time, so I won't go through these details. I can provide the slides if that's okay. So that will kind of give you some ideas. Basically, this is showing that the PCI controls and then how we interpret what those PCI controls for SSH might be. But it would be, for each company, it might be interpreted slightly differently. Same thing with NIST IR. Again, I have the same mapping, but NIST IR has just recently, there's just recently a release of a NIST IR on how to control your automated SSH usage and how to get a handle of that. So that's a good document. Again, if I can provide the link to that document as well. And I think that if I don't go through this, again, this is the same scenario that with the PCI, and I can pass that information off to you guys.
So first, let me thank Joe Scaff for the presentation. Nice to see you.